At 3:47 p.m., a routine Harlem afternoon stepped onto a trapdoor.
Inside the Palm Cafe, a Harlem power broker sat at his usual corner table. Coffee, cigars, and quiet business.
Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski walked in like a warning, badges visible, hands resting where violence begins.
They moved straight to his table and announced the arrest, loud enough for the whole room to become a witness.
The charges came stacked: gambling, narcotics, assault, delivered like bullets, but without the paper to prove them. Bumpy didn't stand. He asked who paid them this week, and the room felt it.
Sullivan's expression shifted fast, like a man realizing his secret had been named.
Sullivan grabbed his arm, tried to yank him up, and Bumpy stayed anchored in the chair.
Resisting arrest became the next charge, because labels are easier than proof.
Every person inside understood this wasn't just an arrest.
At 3:49 p.m., Detective Marcus Thompson walked in, and the plan hit friction.
Thompson asked one thing: what's the basis? And suddenly nobody could hide behind volume.
He demanded the warrant and the alleged assault report, because law needs receipts. They exchanged a glance, because they didn't expect a cop to check a cop.
The warrant was back at the precinct, which meant they brought threats, not authority.
Thompson asked for probable cause, and the room waited for evidence that never came. He told them to release Johnson, because without law, it wasn't arrest, it was abduction.
They backed down, but they didn't surrender, and they promised they would return with paper.
Bumpy told them to inform their paymasters. This ends only when he decides.
Johnson thanked Thompson quietly, and Thompson knew it could cost him his career.
Thompson warned him the officers had backing, and backing doesn't forget being embarrassed.
Johnson smiled like a man already turning danger into opportunity.
Within 24 hours, the story left the cafe and entered the city's shadows. Kowalski left the precinct that night, and he never made it back to his life.
His car sat undamaged, as if the night had swallowed only the person. Sullivan woke up nervous, trapped between fear and the need to appear innocent. He drove toward work, but the route ended somewhere the department couldn't openly map.
By morning, Sullivan's car was found, unlocked, keys in place, like a staged disappearance.
What followed wasn't about spectacle. It was about ink, signatures, and irreversible details.
40 hours later, that same power broker walked into the precinct, carrying the leverage that could break it.
The precinct went silent because everyone understood why he'd come.
Johnson asked for Captain Morrison, calm, specific, and not asking twice.
His attorney moved with him, but his men stayed back, by design.
Within minutes, Morrison emerged, bringing authority and anxiety with him. Lieutenant Chen joined him, because this wasn't a normal visitor.
Morrison ordered him upstairs, and the building listened as they moved. Once the door closed, threats could finally speak at full volume. Morrison demanded to know where Sullivan and Kowalski were, immediately.
He promised charges that never end, like law itself could swallow a man.
Johnson set a briefcase down, like he was setting down the future.
He laid down copies of handwritten confessions, signed, dated, and lethal.
Morrison read line after line, and the room lost its heat.
Chen recognized names he'd worked beside, and he couldn't unread them.
Johnson said the officers were safe, then explained what safety would cost.
What they saw were copies. The originals were placed beyond their reach. If Johnson got arrested or harmed, the originals would surface everywhere.
Morrison called it extortion, because that word felt safe than panic. Johnson framed it as an offer: avoid scandal and stop the paid harassment.
He wanted one thing:
No more police pressure bought by rivals and politics.
In that office, Morrison faced a choice: peace today or ruin tomorrow.
Johnson moved from threat to terms, because leverage only works when it's specific.
First condition: no investigation into the disappearances, because investigation leads to daylight.
Second, the officers return alive, because bodies create questions no one can bury. Third, punishment stays internal, just enough to look real, not enough to open doors. And the core demand stayed simple: no more paid police pressure.
Morrison didn't argue the numbers. He argued with what the numbers could do.
Chen saw what it implied: not just crooked cops, but leaders who looked away.
Morrison asked the only defense left: what stops Johnson from publishing, regardless?
Johnson said chaos is bad for business, and he wanted business, not endless war.
The office narrowed to a single decision, because denial no longer fit on the page.
They read and reread the lines, because every line was a career breaking in half.
Finally, Morrison asked the practical question: where are my officers, and when do they come back? Johnson gave a corner, a morning, and a minute, like he'd already rehearsed it.
They would claim unknown parties, because the truth had too many consequences. Morrison nodded, because the paper left him no clean path out.
He warned Johnson to never repeat it, because next time might be pure retaliation.
They shook hands like enemies, signing a treaty neither side wanted to explain. Johnson walked out under 100 eyes, and nobody moved to stop him.
A criminal had just negotiated with the police, and the police had accepted the price.
Saturday morning arrived, and the corner became a stage for the department's lie.
At 8:03, 2 missing officers reappeared exactly where Johnson said they would.
They were alive, visibly roughed up, and suddenly careful with every step.
They returned to the precinct and stepped into the story they'd been told to tell. The report blamed unknown kidnappers and avoided the one name everyone was thinking. The absence was the message. Some truths were too expensive to write down.
They were suspended for unauthorized absence, a punishment that protected the larger secret.
Morrison warned them. One more slip, and the informal protection was gone forever. Fear did what ethics training couldn't, because consequences became personal.
The pattern shifted. Fewer setups, fewer planted problems, fewer paid interruptions. It wasn't kindness that kept order. It was the knowledge that the originals still existed.
The rival power heard what happened, because secrets like that don't stay local.
Using dirty cops as pressure had worked for years, until paper turned it into a trap.
Morrison managed corruption quietly, because loud reform would confirm everything Johnson claimed.
Publishing would burn the leverage. Keeping it quiet kept the pressure working every day.
Harlem turned it into legend because it sounded impossible, and it still felt true.
September 1964 proved a hard truth. Leverage can bend institutions when force cannot. And it all started with a staged arrest attempt that couldn't survive one honest question.
The city calmed, but the list still existed. Quiet leverage, waiting for the next test. For the next 4 years, Harlem lived under that quiet truce, until time forced an ending.
After the deal, life resumed. But every routine now carried a quiet warning.
The originals vanished into secrecy, because secrecy made them stronger than headlines. Morrison didn't reform the precinct. He tightened it, quietly, to survive. In practice, Johnson became a problem, and the precinct could not touch without detonating itself.
When Sullivan returned, he moved like a man who finally believed consequences were real.
Kowalski didn't try to get even. He tried to stay invisible and employed.
Everyone understood the new math. One wrong move, and the list becomes public.
Gigante heard what happened, and he heard it with one question. Where's the paper?
Guns end a night. Paper can end an organization, and everyone knew it.
His strategy backfired. Bribery works until someone documents it better than you do.
The harassment didn't end with an announcement. It ended with hesitation and fear.
Thompson kept watching because the moment at the cafe needed follow-through. In 1965, the city tested the truce, the way storms test a weak roof.
The reminder didn't need words. Everyone knew the list still existed somewhere.
Morrison quietly transferred the worst offenders, not to fix corruption, just to move it.
The papers weren't just about cops. They brushed politics, and politics hates paper. Full reform meant pulling one thread and watching the whole fabric tear.
He didn't need to shout. The city's imagination did the shouting for him.
He understood war costs money, attention, and bodies, so he chose leverage instead.
The list didn't attack, it defended, like armor made of signatures and fear.
More than once, someone considered pressure, then remembered what pressure could publish.
The word "if" kept men honest, because "if" meant consequences with addresses. By 1967, the truce held, but time was starting to tighten the knot.
Behind the scenes, his body hinted that leverage doesn't stop the clock. The legend grew, because a story like that becomes a warning people repeat.
One question hung in the air. What happens to the paper when he's gone?
In 1968, the clock caught up, and the leverage faced its final test.
His death came quietly, and quiet deaths don't trigger alarms or investigations. After he was gone, the originals were destroyed, because paper can outlive people.
The papers vanished, but the lesson stayed. Leverage can bend power without firing a shot.
Because his death drew no investigation, the dead man's switch never needed to fire. With Johnson gone, Morrison felt relief and a new kind of fear about what returns. The ink became ash, and the most dangerous evidence became a rumor.
Once the paper was gone, only stories remained, and stories can't convict anyone.
In neighborhoods like Harlem, a king's absence doesn't end conflict.
Thompson stayed, because one clean officer can still change what others believe is normal. Departments don't just hide scandals, they learn to forget them without writing it down.
They finished their careers quieter than them began, shaped by a fear they couldn't explain.
New York runs on paper, and paper is the one weapon everyone respects.
The whole chain began with one interruption, an officer demanding the law be shown.
When the warrant didn't appear, the entire arrest collapsed like a bad stage prop.
Without proof, authority can become a crime wearing a uniform. Johnson's real weapon wasn't muscle, it was information arranged into leverage.
In that warehouse, paper replaced courts, and fear replaced procedure.
They wrote because refusal had an immediate cost, and confession looked like survival.
The nightmare wasn't the copies. It was the originals living somewhere out of reach.
He caved because the department had built a problem too big to arrest.
The agreement spread, because silence like that always has witnesses.
Leverage can hold a line, but time eventually cuts every rope.
Corruption survives on silence and die when someone keeps receipts.
Decades later, people still tell it, not as history, but as a warning.
The legend is dramatic, but the mechanism is simple. Proof,
changes power.
The deeper story isn't one man. It's a system that made his leverage possible.
While powerful men played chess, ordinary people lived inside the consequences.
Thompson proved one person can interrupt corruption if he's willing to be seen doing it.
In 72 hours, a routine setup became a negotiation that reshaped an entire precinct.
Crime, police, and politics formed a triangle, and the papers pierced all three sides at once.
Retaliation risked confirming the story, and confirmation would invite consequences he couldn't control. Public reform would prove negligence, so the cleanup stayed quiet and incomplete. Quiet stability isn't justice, but in 1964, it was the bargain everyone took.
It began at 3:47, with 2 badges and a table that refused to move.
It looked like an arrest, but it functioned like a transaction, paid in advance. One question forced the truth into the room. The arrest had an employer.
Thompson asked for the warrant, and the whole plan began to fail in public.
When corruption fails publicly, it doesn't apologize. It escalates privately.
The twist wasn't kidnapping. It was turning kidnapping into signed documentation.
The climax was a handshake, built on fear, paper, and a city that wanted quiet.
The resolution arrived on schedule because leverage keeps its promises to prove it's real.
After that week, the precinct moved differently because the list changed what risk meant.
This ending isn't clean, because the city's power games rarely are. What we know is simple. Leverage changed decisions that force could not. Power fears documentation, because documentation outlives intimidation.
The corner table sits empty now, but the story still occupies the room.
The precinct door closed on the incident, but not on what it revealed. September 1964 wasn't about who had the most force. It was about who held the strongest leverage.